Hi, Phil Goldberg here. Welcome to section 2 of our 4-part Facebook Live series on the life of Yogananda, both the life and the book. I'm really excited to be here. I'm actually recording this or doing this live from Hay House headquarters in Carlsbad, California, where I happen to be visiting. And we're very excited that the book will be out in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks from today will be the official publication date. But of course, you can pre-order it now, and we encourage you to do so. You can pre-order it online for immediate shipping when it's available to be shipped. And as an incentive to do that, I created a 20-minute audio that will help you sort of read between the lines of this extensive and comprehensive biography to get the most out of it on a personal level, because there is much to be learned from a life as rich and deep and enlightening as Yogananda's. And so I put together an audio called Life Lessons from the Life of Yogananda. And if you go to my website, philipgoldberg.com, you will find information about pre-ordering and the gift. So today, I want to talk a bit about Yogananda's early life. One of the great pleasures of researching the book was diving deeply into the circumstances of his early years in India, from birth to throughout his adolescence and his college years, and then the years with his guru, Sri Yukteswar, before at age 27 he came to America and started the chapter of his life that would make him famous and beloved worldwide. So that early part, those early years, which occupy probably more than about a third of the biography, I just want to tell you a little bit about that today. Because one of the interesting things I found was, there's this old nature-nurture debate, how much of our personalities and how we express ourselves in the world is rooted in our own inner nature, biologically, genetically, in terms of heredity and so forth, and how much is nurture, meaning the environment, our upbringing, our parents, all that kind of environmental influence. And of course, we know that it's really an intricate combination of those two things. But when you look at Yogananda's life, you see how those two elements, what he came to life with, whether you think it's biologically determined genetics, or you believe in past lives and the influence of previous incarnations. He came into this life as a unique being, and you see it played out throughout from the earliest years. But he was also, like the rest of us, a human being in a particular family, at a particular time, in particular places, in a particular culture, and those things also influenced him. And so that combination that you see shaping up when you do research, you will find that, I think, illuminating. Let's talk about some of that now. Yogananda was not always Yogananda, obviously. He had a birth name and a family name, and that was Mukunda Lal Ghosh. Family name was Ghosh, Ghosh. He was born, now most of his devotees know this, of course, but for those of you who don't, he was born January 5th, 1893. And that was a significant year in the history of India's spiritual wisdom coming to the West, because his illustrious predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, in 1893, just 9 months after Yogananda was born, made his great triumphant appearances at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, thereby launching his contribution to that transmission of Indian philosophy and yogic ideas and practices onto America. A transmission that I am convinced is absolutely vital to understanding the spiritual and cultural era that we live in, and all the trends in religion and spirituality that I wrote about in my previous book, American Veda. So that very year, Yogananda was born, and he was determined, or he was destined, I should say, to be the next major figure to come to the West, a generation after Vivekananda. And Vivekananda, I should add, was a kind of role model, because if you go to Calcutta, where Yogananda's family moved when he was 13, and we'll talk about Calcutta in a minute, where the family home is. And I take people to Calcutta on tours, American Veda tours, and commercial break, if you're interested in the next one, which is in September and October, which will include Calcutta and all the sites associated with Yogananda, go to my website and you'll see it. But if you go there, you see that where Yogananda spent his teen years and his college years, most of his college years, is a short walk from where Vivekananda grew up. And Vivekananda's lineage has its headquarters up the river from there. And Vivekananda and Vivekananda's guru, the great Sri Ramakrishna, their presence in that area had a big impact on Yogananda. So it's kind of auspicious that he was born the year that Vivekananda became famous in the West. His upbringing was comfortably affluent, what we would think of as upper middle class, probably. His mother came from an affluent family, but she was, by all accounts, a humble and gracious woman who cared very little for material things, had a deep spiritual life of her own while raising her 10 children. And his father was a relatively high-ranking official, an accountant by trade, in the railway system that the British created and ran. So he essentially worked for the British Empire's railway system, which is quite extensive, of course, in India, and worked his way up from very humble upbringings and early tragedies to become a comfortably successful man. So Yogananda grew up in those kind of circumstances, but with a humble, non-materialistic kind of household. His father was a deeply spiritual man and set an example of devotional life and regular spiritual practice that had a big impact on Yogananda. And by all accounts, everybody thinks of their departed mothers as saints, or most of us, but she may have lived up to the designation, because she was, by all accounts, an exceptionally wonderful person. So he had that kind of kindness and generosity on one hand, and an example of great discipline and spiritual devotion as well, growing up. And they lived in 4 different cities in India, in the north and east of India, because his father was transferred a few times. And during those years, at age 11, one of the interesting things, before I get to that, one of the interesting things in researching the book was sort of speculating on those different cities that they lived in different circumstances, and what kind of influence the personality of those cities may have had on young Yogananda, Mukunda, and the schools he went to, and other circumstances. You'll find it, I'm sure, very interesting. But the defining event of his early years occurred when he was 11 and his mother died suddenly. And it was deeply traumatic. And the circumstances around that are fascinating. When you read about it, you'll see that there were early signs of Yogananda's exceptional, what we could think of as exceptional intuitive qualities or psychic abilities. You know, a lot of miraculous things happened around Yogananda and in his life, and circumstances of his mother's death were part of that. But it had a big impact on him. It was the most traumatic event of his life. He adored his mother. And to his credit, because a lot of, gurus don't speak about their personal lives very much, especially the ones who are renunciates from an early age. But he did. He wrote about it, his mother's death, in his autobiography. And he wrote a wonderfully, fairly long poem about his mother and her dark eyes that he could never forget, that you can find in his books. And it had the interesting effect of not only being the defining tragedy of his life and the defining loss and the wound that some wounds like that never go away, but it also sort of the loss of his earthly mother led to a strengthening of devotion to the Divine Mother, the feminine forms of God, that became an important focal point of Yogananda's devotional life, and for the rest of his life, and that you see manifested throughout his life. The family moved to Calcutta when he was 13. And I should say at this point that in addition to whatever Yogananda wrote about his personal life, his family, early life, his childhood, in his autobiography, which is a good deal, there were other sources that provided information that is not in the autobiography. His own talks later in life. His brother wrote a memoir. One of his closest friends and fellow swamis wrote a memoir about their childhood together. And there were other sources, including things I learned when I researched his life in India, and especially in Calcutta. And for me, one of the joys of doing this was from the time he was 13 till the time he came to America, he lived in Calcutta, except for the couple of years he lived in the city of Serampore, not far away, where his guru Sri Yukteswar's ashram was. But Calcutta, the city, was had a formative influence on him. We're all influenced by where we spend our teenage years, and part of his formation was the city itself. Calcutta in those years was a really fascinating place, and I just loved learning about it and writing about it, and I think you'll find it fascinating too. It was the center of political life in India at the time. It was the capital of the British Empire's outpost in India until they moved it to New Delhi. And it was the cultural capital, the educational capital, the artistic capital, and the spiritual center as well. So he grew up in this sort of ferment, and the neighborhood in Calcutta where he lived, if you spend time in Greenwich Village or you know the history of Greenwich Village in New York, you'll find it similar, tree-lined streets. But at the time, in those early years of the 20th century, it was artists and intellectuals were doing a lot of progressive things, sometimes radical things. It was a center of great education. There were universities and great schools in the area. And it was the center of the political revolution that would eventually topple the empire and grant India its independence. So there was ferment around him. And a lot of saints and swamis and gurus and ashrams. And that was, Yogananda was influenced by all of that, but he was, from a very early age, he knew he was after God. He was going to be a yogi, and he knew very early that he aspired to the life of a monk, the life of a renunciate, what in India is called a sannyasi. And he longed for that at ages where most young men are thinking about, fantasizing becoming a basketball star or the president or an astronaut or whatever. He was dreaming of becoming a sannyasi one day. And he had a devotional life. Wherever the family moved, he would stake out a place to create a little meditation area and an altar for devotional practice at an extraordinary young age. And when he entered into his adolescence and teen years, you see the early stages of a natural leader's life. You remember when you were a kid, there were other kids who were the natural leaders, the instigators, the sort of ringleaders, as we would call them, the ones who would come up with ideas for doing stuff, the ones who would gather people together, the ones who would dream up adventures, the ones who would say, let's have a game, and he would round it up and get the place to play and the equipment and everything. Or if it was women, it might be the party or whatever it was. There were people who were natural leaders. He was one of those young men. Only instead of organizing soccer games or some mischief, well, he did have a mischievous side. He did organize a lot of sort of practical jokes and rebellious things, but they were of an more innocent nature. He was also quite a young athlete, which surprises a lot of people, but he was a very skilled runner. He won races a lot. He also learned to wrestle. But the bulk of his leadership was directed at what really, really mattered to him, which was the pursuit of deep spiritual experiences. He knew from a very early age that that's what he wanted. That's what he was after. So he would organize, he would gather his fellow seekers, this handful of good friends, and they would go to the nearby temples for the rituals or the worship ceremonies. They would find places to meditate in gardens and places like that. They would go up the river once they were old enough to do things like that to the great Kali temple in the town of Dakshineswar. And anytime there was a visiting guru or a new Swami that people heard about, they knew to tell young Mukunda, because he would want to go see that person and be in that person's presence and learn from that person, sit with that person, absorb that person's eminence. And that's what he did. He did that a lot. And some of those characters that he would meet, and these yogis and swamis and so forth, he wrote about in his autobiography, but there were many others he didn't, to quite the same extent. But those people had a big influence on him. They were his early mentors, his early role models, and his early teachers. And so I go into a lot of those relationships in the book, and the adventures, the spiritual adventures that he and his friends would have had when he was leading them as a young teenager. He even started his own ashram when he was about 15. It was a small little place nearby in Calcutta, but they would start having spiritual gatherings, what are called satsangs. Sat meaning truth, and sang being a derivative of the word sangha, which means community. So it's gatherings for the search for the truth, deep spiritual truth. And he acquired meditation practices and yoga practices from various sources, and he would lead the others in doing them. And this was a major part of his young life. And he always knew that one day he would meet his destined guru. He had visions of that person. And he has always assumed that he would meet that person up in the Himalayas, where the great yogis go and dwell. And he tried first at age 11, shortly after his mother's death, and then a couple more times in his teenage years, to escape. He was a runaway, but he was not running to, the big city and the bright lights, and he wasn't escaping an abusive or a difficult life at home. He just wanted union with the divine. He wanted that deep fulfillment of the promise of yoga. And so he left. He got on trains heading to the Himalayas. And first time he did it, he was 11, and his older brother tracked him down and brought him home before he got to the Himalayas. And he had several more aborted attempts at this, which I find fascinating. And one of them he wrote about at considerable length in the autobiography, but I filled in other details to tell the story. And he got as far as the city of Hardwar, which is a sort of gateway point. And to get from Calcutta to there by train was a series of train rides over the course of a couple of days. And he and a friend made it all the way to Hardwar before they got tracked down again and apprehended and brought home. And this kind of escape was so frightened his older brother and his father, especially after the death of the mother, when they were responsible for the 10 children. Yogananda was the second oldest son and the fourth oldest child. So he had 4 siblings below. There were, did I say 10? No, 8. Sorry. And there were older siblings and younger siblings. And his oldest brother died at a tragically young age, making Yogananda the eldest son, which is a position of great importance in an Indian family. And his father just could not countenance his son running off to become a renunciate living in caves and ashrams, especially when, at that young age. So they did everything they could to talk him out of it and prevent him from doing it, trying to find him gurus and people like that close to home so he could fulfill his need for that without running away. And they kept an eye on him, and they managed to apprehend him the few times he tried to run away before he got to his, destination in the high Himalayas, which is, I count as a very exciting thing to write about, but also very telling that somebody knew what he was destined to be from a very early age, but he didn't know the details. And after the death of his brother, the father wanted very much for Yogananda to live a normal life in the Hindu sense. And he did everything he could. They arranged marriage for him 3 different times, turned it all down. When he graduated college, his father got him a really choice job that most young Indian men would have killed for in the railway system. He said he had no interest in that. But along the way, after graduating high school, when he spent time in Benares at an ashram, he met his guru. And it was a chance, what seemed to be a chance encounter, but was obviously a destined to happen in the alleys and streets of Benares. And that encounter, of course, was the life-changing moment. And he always thought he'd find his guru in the Himalayas, but he found him in Benares. And it turned out that the guru's ashram, main ashram, was in the city of Serampore, which is just a few hours away from Calcutta. And that's where Yogananda spent most of his time during what would have been a more typical college years for people. He spent the first 2 years of college in Calcutta, going to Serampore as often as he could, and then transferred and spent the next 2 years at the college in Serampore so he could be with his guru. And of course, when he first decided to be with the guru and the guru took him on as a disciple, Yogananda had no interest in going to college at all. But his guru said, no, you're going to college. If you want to be my disciple, you will do it while you go to college and you'll finish, because you are destined to go to the West and bring these yogic teachings to the Western world. And they will take you more seriously if you have a college degree. And I also think he probably understood that if Yogananda had a college education, he'd be better able to relate to the Western mind, because the colleges had a strong British influence at that time. He would understand the West, understand English, and understand what made the West tick and how to talk to Westerners. And so he did. He finished college. But what's one of the interesting things is he, like a lot of very creative people, very successful people, and artists and inventors and entrepreneurs, he didn't like school at all. He couldn't stand it, didn't want to do it. But he stayed in high school and he stayed in college because it would have hurt his father very deeply if he didn't finish. And if, in the case of college, it would have displeased his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And so he toughed it out for their sake, totally ignoring school most of the time, but rising to the occasion. And the stories about how he passed his final exams to graduate high school and again 4 years later to graduate college are charming, because they required a lot of last-minute effort and a lot of what some of us would call coincidence and others would call luck, but that he understood to be divine intervention. The cosmos was on his side in getting these things accomplished in his life so he could move on to do the work he always wanted to do. And that started after he finished college. And, the kind of lineage he was in, the orientation his guru had, was not a monastic life of seclusion. Some monastics, some swamis and renunciates live isolated lives, either totally alone or in small communities and ashrams. And some are active in the world. And Sri Yukteswar believed in active monks in the world, making a contribution to the society, to those who needed spiritual and material upliftment. And that, he said, was Yogananda's destiny, whether he liked it or not. And at first he didn't, but he understood that to be his mission in life. And when he left for the West, it was because his own guru and his guru's guru and some of the other saints he met understood or realized that he was destined for that life. And so he took on that responsibility. What you see in Yogananda's young life is a really interesting combination, not only of nature and nurture, but of somebody who truly valued tradition and honored tradition. You saw that in his life as a teacher, where he was extremely faithful to his lineage. He honored the gurus in his lineage all the time. He venerated and revered his own guru and his guru's guru and all the great teachers and all the great yogis. He was very faithful in rendering the traditional knowledge to others and expressing it properly, in honoring the ritual life of his tradition, of honoring his parents and family. At the same time, he was very unconventional. He was rebellious. He was radical in many ways, and a fiercely independent dude right from his very earliest years. He was willful. When he wanted his way and he knew he was right, he would stand up for his truth no matter what. And he held out for the vision he had for his own life against the cultural sort of mandates of family dharma, that like his brother did, to marry a certain way at a certain time to a certain kind of person, to have a career in the family tradition and so forth. He would have none of that. He knew his destiny, his dharma was different and not the one that was expected of him. And he got that at an early age and stuck to his guns, and that characterized his life. And that's one of the life lessons I think we can take from Yogananda, that fierce understanding of who he was and what he had to do and what his destiny was, and to stick by that regardless of the social pressures and the family pressures. And it broke his father's heart at several points, but his father came around in the end and understood. And it was very sweet to see how they interacted and how that relationship played out. So that's a quick summary of Yogananda's early years, the India phase of his life. And at age 27, he felt the calling in very interesting and mysterious ways that it was time to come to the West, and it all came together for him. We'll go into that next time. And of course, all these, I'm just giving you a taste. It's all in the book, and I hope I've whet your appetite for it. Again, you can find out details about it on the Hay House website and my own, philipgoldberg.com. I hope you pre-order it. And please do come to my events. This is April 10th and tomorrow in Encinitas, California, where Yogananda had, a gorgeous ashram retreat house built in 1930s that still exists and is still gorgeous and beautiful, and there's a great presence here of Yogananda. I'm going to do the first public event here at Soul of Yoga tomorrow night, April 11th. Next Sunday, the 15th, I do the first event for the book talk and book signing at Tantris, Tantris Yoga in West Hollywood in LA. And there are other events coming up as well. I hope you go to my website and check my calendar. I'll be in different parts of the country in May, June, and July. And New York, Boston, the Bay Area, Chicago, Seattle, Portland. And I hope you come and say hello in person. I hope you like the book. When you read it, please do contact me. Let me know what you think. Stay in touch. And we'll be doing another one of these Facebook Lives 1 week from today on the 17th. This one at noon Pacific time. Thank you for being with me. See ya. Namaste.